Okay, class, today we will be kicking off Lesson 1.1, Analyzing Categorical Data. We'll be talking about bar graphs, marginal joint and conditional relative frequencies using two-way tables, using bar graphs to compare distributions of categorical data. We'll be discussing a new concept, association. Alright, so let's get started. So I've pre-filled some of the data from y'all's summer assignment. So this is data from all sections of AP Statistics for the year 2020-2021. And before we get started, let's look at the key question we're asking. Is being an athlete at Jesuit associated with certain favorite childhood activities? Okay, so let's get started. The first question asks, what are the individuals and what are the variables? And you'll recall we discussed this in our last class, so we should recognize that the individuals are the students who responded to the survey, and the variables are favorite activity and athlete status. Now again, recalling from our last lesson, can we recognize whether each of these variables is categorical or quantitative? In other words, do they measure categories or can they be counted? So we can recognize that they are both categorical. Okay, so let's get started with making a bar graph of this data. So I'm going to label my axes. Favorite activity and frequency. And we've got sports, Legos, video games, TV, and reading. And for my scale, since we go up to about 32, I'm going to mark it off 10, 20, 30, 40. Okay, so sports, we're at about 32. Legos, 15. Video games, a little higher at 17. None for TV. And reading, we have a count of 3. Okay, so making a pie chart of the athlete data. So there are 34 out of the 67 responses marked yes to athletes, so that's about 50% or 50.7%. And for 33 out of 67, that's about 49.3%. So pretty relatively evenly split non-athletes and athletes. Just a couple notes here. Take a look at how I labeled my axes on the bar graph. So it's frequencies or counts, and I have my variable at the bottom. However, for the pie chart, note that these are percentages, right? So my non-athletes were about 49.3%. So this whole pie chart must add up to 100%. Okay, moving on. So I also pre-filled out the data here. So this is what we call a two-way table. So I will use this to answer the following questions. Now each of these, as we go along, these are relative frequencies. So let's start with what the first question is asking. The percentage of students who chose Legos. So the percentage of total students, 67, who chose Legos, it's 15, which, let me look up quickly, It's about 22.4%. Okay, the next question asks the percentage of students who are non-athletes and chose Legos. So they're non-athletes, chose Legos, 10 over the total count of 67. Which is about 14.9%. Lastly, we're asking for the percentage of athletes who chose Legos. So, who in this athlete column chose Legos? 5 out of a total of 34 athletes, which is about 14.7%. So a bit of new vocab. This is what we call a marginal relative frequency. This is a joint relative frequency and a conditional relative frequency. So which variable do we think would best explain or predict the other variable? So do we think that athlete status helps predict favorite activity, or favorite activity helps predict athlete status? So this could go either way, but I think intuitively I would say athlete status might predict favorite activity. Okay, now we're going to try our hand at making a side-by-side bar graph of the data. So I'll start off labeling my axes. Are you an athlete? Yes or no? And here, on my y-axis, I'm interested in relative frequency from 0 to 100%. So, alright, so I'm set up and good to go. So I calculated the relative frequencies beforehand, but let's go ahead and fill this out and see how it looks. So for athletes, 62% said sports, about 15% said Legos, a little higher, 18% said video games. We have a 0 for TV, and 6% reading. And for those students who are not athletes, 33% said sports, about 30% said Legos, 33% video games, 0 for TV, and 3% reading. Okay, now a segmented bar graph of the data. This is a relatively similar process. Setting this up. Athlete, yes or no. And we'll go 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Now the difference here with the segmented bar graph is that it has to equal 100%, and we're stacking these bars on top of each other. So about 62% were sports, 15 Legos, maybe a little low, 15 Legos, 18 video games, 6% reading, and 0 for TV. For non-athletes, we had about 33% say sports, 30% say Legos, 33%. This is also not drawn to scale, but 33% or so video games and 3% reading. So this slice should have been smaller than this one, so excuse my drawing, but you get the picture. Okay. Now the question, how do the bars in the side-by-side bar graph relate to the bars in the segmented bar graph? If we stacked the side-by-side bar graph, we get the segmented bar graph. All right. Is there an association between athlete status and type of activity? What do we think? I would think yes, based off what I'm seeing. In other words, if I know your athlete status, I can better predict favorite activity. Okay, here's some new vocab. Now, if there was not an association, what would these graphs look like? I would expect if there was not an association, then the bars would look the same between athletes and non-athletes. Okay, let's write this out. Look for both athletes and non-athletes. So in other words, for the side-by-side, you can imagine maybe the yes looks something like this, and the no would look the same. Or for the segmented bar graph, if the bars showed something similar. Okay. Now you'll want to go ahead and write these down. These are your big takeaways, and they'll help you to complete the check your understanding on your own. So let's kind of review what we've gone through. Categorical variables, we talked about these in lesson 1.1, but expanded on them further here. So you can report frequencies as counts or relative frequencies we looked at both graphs and pie charts, okay? Diving deeper into relative frequencies, we used a two-way table to calculate an example of each of these, of a marginal relative frequency, joint, and conditional. And you can use this as kind of a key to quickly identify what type of relative frequency you're being asked to calculate. And lastly, we touched on association. So there is an association between two variables if knowing the outcome of one event affects the outcome of another event. And we talked about looking to the bar graphs for signals of this. We would not see association if, for example, the segmented bar graph showed bars of the same size. All right? So on your own, I'm going to ask you to complete this check your understanding, and in our next class period, we will go over this together to see how you did. All right? Thanks, everyone.